Hello, hello. This is Silas. I'm back here with Steven. Say what's up.
Hello, everyone.
We're going to be continuing our series of talks. We have many different conversations talking about different topics. First one was you are what you consume, talking about the things that you intake, not just the food, but also the mental stuff. And that's kind of what has, I think, informed the rest of the series and the conversations I want to get into. Because humans are made up of more than just the physical things, the proteins, fats and carbohydrates that your body converts into your physical self, but what builds up our minds and our thoughts and our ability to think and navigate I don't like using navigate, navigate our reality tunnels. And then after that, we had a series on, I think it was critical theory. And there's something, I think I'm missing something. No, 1619 project, and it was
Oh yeah,
critical theory.
yeah.
And now we're on to talking about the higher education system by reading by through the lens of, or Stephen has been reading, is reading Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education by Jason Brennan and Phillip Magness. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and why we're doing this?
Sure. So this book, you can probably tell by the title, it has to do with the various ethical concerns in the university system. Now, this book does not focus so much on the ideology that's taught, although, of course, the authors would be critical of it, as have we. If you watch the whole series on cynical theories, we get pretty in depth on that. This is more focusing on the college structure as far as the incentives, as far as funding, as far as the way the money is used, as far as professors not caring, as far as students paying for things that don't benefit them, et cetera, et cetera. And the authors wanted to explore this, as do we, because I think there are a lot of things that people don't know out there, and I think we're coming close to hitting sort of the apex, I think, with the student debt bubble of all these people spending all this money, getting all these degrees and things that they never use, being unprepared for the work world, all that. And I like to say that this book, it doesn't have all the answers, but it does ask a lot of the right questions. And hopefully, if more and more conversations like this happen, this will lead to some change being made, whichever form that may take.
Yeah. So with this one, it's going to be focusing mostly on the 9,000 or so higher education institutions of higher education, higher learning, higher schooling, whatever you want to refer to them as, colleges and universities and post-grad institutions in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the rest of the world kind of is copying and trying to match what is happening in the United States of America. At least when I look at being recording this from Kenya and a developing nation and looking at that. I know Europe has its own unique systems in the different countries that they go through, but you see a lot of people still sending their kids from other countries. There's a lot of people coming into the United States of America from other countries to learn there because there is this idea that that is the best location to actually share information about being better prepared to be a more successful human being and increase human flourishing. And that's what we are for. But I think from our experience and our observations, we're making the case that that might not quite be the most optimal place. There's places that are a lot worse, of course,
Yeah.
but I think even with the current abilities that we have right now, there's a lot better that we can do. And with this series, we'll be going into that. We've recorded 2 parts so far. The first part, we're going to go for every chapter of the book. So there's 11 chapters. I shall list the chapters there. But we just recorded something about 7 big economic insights, and then normative business ethics questions and descriptive business ethics questions. And
Right.
these are things we shall be referring to as we have this conversation. And we don't want to go through them every time, but those are things that the authors themselves decided that, hey, these are important things, or this is kind of how we're approaching the content in this. And these are questions that I think you out there listening, and thank you for listening, should actually keep this in mind as you listen to the content, and even just in general when you come across things, not just in education, but in the world in general. I think these are helpful things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So the contents, the first one we read were neither gremlins nor poltergeists.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get into today what the academics really want. Then the next one will be why most academic advertising is immoral bullshit. Reading entrails and student evaluations is number 4. Number 5 is grades, communication breakdown. Number 6 will be when moral language is a cover for self-interest. Number 7 will be the general education hustle. Number 8 will be why universities produce too many PhDs. Number 9, we cheaters everywhere. Number 10, 3 big myths about what's plaguing higher education. And number 11, answering the taxpayers. And then after that, we'll do one just closing everything up. So this is going to be the third one in the series. You don't have to listen to all of them in order, but you might as well I think you should at least listen to the one specific about the the business ethics questions and the 7 big economic insights.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
definitely.
so you ready? We're going to get into chapter 2, what the academics really want. Go ahead, Steve.
Sure. So our authors start off here with just sort of talking about how this section is really going to examine the incentives of academics. And when we say academics, we don't just mean professors. We also mean students and administrators as well, because all of these things, you'll find that there are some conflicts here as far as what do administrators want, what do teachers want, what do students want. And when you break down what each one wants, it makes perfect sense, but you can see how they would conflict with each other. For example, our authors open here with a decade ago how the Georgetown McDonough School of Business wanted to improve the MBA program, but they couldn't find teachers to teach it. Now, the reason for this they found is that a lot of teachers actually prefer teaching undergrads. They find them more fun. But teaching MBAs is not as fun. It also has a higher workload. So you can see that's one of those incentives where they want a good MBA program. They want good people to teach it, but good people don't want to teach it. So it becomes an afterthought. That's the kind of thing that this is going to touch on.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's a key thing also. There's like academia is the whole institution. Like if you're a janitor employed there, if you're a landscaper, if you're somebody who builds like the actual construction of the buildings, you kind of are somewhat involved in academia, but you wouldn't necessarily be an academic. But when you talk about academics, it's the teachers, the students, the researchers, the people who are actually involved in the studies directly, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what the faculty want, most fields graduate more PhDs per year than there are jobs for PhDs. There will be more on this in a later chapter. I think of Tom Woods talking about how when he actually was studying at Columbia, the PhD dissertation advisor said, I don't know why you guys are here. There aren't jobs. This will look good on your resume because it's Columbia University, but the odds of you getting a job are very slim. And this was in the early 90s when they said there were more jobs available in the academia. And he talked about, he taught community college for a bit, but he talked about going to job applications. There'd be 400 people applying. So again, this will be covered more in a later chapter, but this is the reality. All these people graduate, they think, oh, I have a PhD. My ticket has been written for me. And no, that's not the case. So Jason Brennan, the author, talks about his department. Last time they hired a 10-year track position, they received 500 applicants. So same thing.
How many?
500.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just crazy to me because like working in restaurants, we put out ad for a server position. You might get like 5 replies, maybe a few more. So, and then you usually pick out of those. But I can't imagine interviewing hundreds of people for one position.
And then that's an interesting thing with that because I'm not necessarily saying that it's above and beyond your average person to be a tenure track, to do what a tenure track academic can possibly do. Yeah. But in general, the server, whatever a server is doing, is something that can be learned. Now, just because you can learn and teach it and do it relatively easily, there also is ability. Like there's a difference between ability and capability, right? Like we might be capable of something, but you be able to go through that process over and over daily, and do it in that way as a server. But then now I think when you actually go to certain higher level studies, there might be some things where you're not even capable. Like you have the mind, yes, you have hands, but you're not able to actually go to that info. Yet you have such a discrepancy on the numbers. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And that's what I find. That's what's kind of interesting. Again, we'll talk about this more as it goes on. But the fact that there's so many people, they talk about oversaturated job markets. That's what this is. The fact there are hundreds of people you could potentially choose from for one position. Stephen Hicks talked about this too. I think he said like something like 8% of philosophy graduates go on to teach it or something. It's like you figure 92% do other things, often go into law or other things. But it's like, is this really worth it? I mean, I think people need to start asking these questions if they're not already.
There is almost no professional field of philosophy. It's always going to be a secondary type of thing that you do. And yet, why are there so many? It's like, imagine if we just decided to stop building pickup trucks and we're like, Lamborghini is a better car. It's more valuable. So let's just spend all our time building like thousands of Lamborghinis that nobody is able to afford or use. But
Yeah.
hey, we have Lamborghinis. Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's like Eric Weinstein said too. Think of it this way: like if you're in a class at school and you're like studying, let's say, gender studies or something else we always bring up. It's not like there's a professorship job waiting for each one of those students. It just logically it makes no sense. It's okay if you get lucky and a professor steps down, retires, passes away, or whatever, but many of these professors teach well into old age. And it's not like universities are being opened everywhere. So it just the supply vastly exceeds the demand. In short, yeah.
One more aside before you continue. I
Sure.
think this kind of reminds me of the thing where I used to see some game shows where people would go on like Price is Right or those type of things, and then they'd win like a car or win a house or win something like that, and like yay! But then I got older and I was kind of thinking about it. With some of those things, it's like you win the car, then all of a sudden there's all this tax money. All of a sudden there's the payments of insurance or the maintenance of the vehicle, where somebody might not be able to afford it. Where it might have been better to actually give them the actual like money. So you almost indebting them by giving them that. Just like imagine if you had a thing where in Africa it's like let's give everybody Lamborghinis. Like what would that actually do and accomplish to the African people? Is it better to be like let's give them bicycles? Like but people just look at the value of something in a vacuum and don't understand the actual things that go around owning that, attaining that. And I guess again that's why I'm saying you should definitely listen to the video about the 7 different things in business and the business ethic questions, because that gives some perspective.
Sorry. I was going to say, I think it was Milton Friedman who brought it up with the healthcare system as well, like talking about certain standards, which standards are good, but if the standards are so high, it becomes expensive. It would be like, you can only drive on this road if you have a nice car. I think he used a Cadillac, but you can pick whichever example. It's like, okay, you're going to see the problem. Not everyone can afford that car. So is it better that people don't drive at all? Or is it better that people, they can settle for less and then look, if they make more money and they want to upgrade down the line, fine, but at least they can drive. It's a similar sort of thing here as well.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, they start off here with adjunct faculty, which are at the low end of the hierarchy. They make about $2,700 per course. They don't have job security. Their classes can be canceled at a moment's notice, and they may not get called back. They don't get benefits, perks, research. They can't march at graduation, and even often aren't listed on the university website. So adjuncts are really bottom of the barrel. The full-time adjuncts make about $30,000 a year, which is like less than I made as a cook starting off. To point out though, full-time adjuncts are a minority. Most of them are part-time. They're usually the type of people who are semi-retired and just want to teach on the side or just keep themselves busy. Sometimes it's people who are successful in certain fields and will be asked to come in and teach, like certain litigators, for example. They'll be asked, hey, do you want to teach this class on litigation or something? We'll pay you for it. So full-time adjuncts tend to be a minority. The full-time ones tend to either be recent PhD graduates who are working towards something better, or sometimes it's people who prefer teaching over the private sector. So, the next step.
So it's either end of the career, but not too many people start as adjuncts.
Yeah, or if they do
in there for a few years and then you get something higher.
Yeah, but they're a minority though, so that makes sense. So next step up are the postdoctoral research fellows and the visiting assistant professors. These positions are usually temporary, about a year or two, and they come with full benefits and about a $50,000 to $75,000 a year salary. So definitely better. Postdocs teach a little, if at all. They're expected to produce publications mostly. Visiting assistant professors may teach 6 or so classes over a single year. They tend not to get much prestige, and like the adjuncts, it's more of a stepping stone towards something better. Next up are the long-term, full-time, non-tenure track teaching positions in U.S. and Canada. They're often called lecturers. They receive about 3 to 5 year rolling contracts renewed yearly. Benefits, offices, computers, expense accounts, and sometimes a role in administration. They're ineligible for tenure, but have solid job security after a certain grace period. So they're not in that position where they can't be fired, but in general, they're more likely to keep a job.
Okay.
So the best positions are the tenure track professorships. They start as assistant professors and they're given 6 to 7 years to prove themselves. If they either get promoted to associate professors or they get fired. It's either you make or you do or die, basically. I guess you can put it that way. And if they do well as assistant professors, they can become full professors. Some will even win endowed university chairs or the prestigious university professor position. So what it takes to get promoted or tenure depends on the university. For example, if you're at a top university, you can only publish things in the top publication. So they make the example in the book, like Idaho State Political Science Journal, just something they made up. If you're at Harvard and you publish something in there, that can be a strike against you because that's considered below your pay grade. Whereas if you're lesser known, that'll get you noticed and maybe work towards something bigger. And the authors point out, they said, look, we used Oxford University Press because our bosses expect high standards from us. So there'll be a section later on more in tenure, but tenure, briefly, they can only be fired for just causes. So, for example, like, okay, if it's a sexual harassment or sexual assault, if they commit a felony, something like that, or serious financial emergencies, and they said that's only if all the non-tenured staff and several administrators have been fired as well. So they're like the last people to go, and at that point, the college is in serious trouble. So these professors often get the best pay, benefits, perks, and often have a say in the administration of the university. They often make more per week than an adjunct makes per class for a whole semester. Wow. Any comments or thoughts or anything?
Yeah, just that stratification is something that to me it's disappointing. It's not surprising. There's something elitist about it, and it's not surprising that the heavily schooled people coming out of that project that onto the rest of the world. And I'm not saying these structures don't exist in the world. Like throughout the whole critical theory conversation we had, we were talking about how there's things that are descriptive, that they observe things and we understand, okay, we see why this works. But then now the prescriptive of saying this is how you actually attach it to why this is happening, that's something different. That's why I prefer something like human action, which will be the next one, where you're looking into the praxeology, like you're looking into why people making these decisions. Mm-hmm. Well, people in general are selfish and they want to get into tenure, they want to get into those positions, they want to maintain certain level of prestige. And this comes to the thing, what do academics want? Do academics really just want to get as much knowledge or factual information away to somebody else? Like, no, they want to get their tenure. They want to get these other things. They want that prestige. They want those names. Somebody might be teaching, not because they're interested in teaching, but because they understand if I spend a year here, it can be on my degree or on my resume. So when I apply for this other job in this government or this position, then I can get that position. So if you actually are thinking, I want an environment where my children and the children of the society, of the group, can go to this place and get people who are really interested in giving them better information for them to be as knowledgeable on these actual topics as possible. Is the school really selecting? Is academia, as it is, really selecting for an environment like that? As you mentioned, why would you not be at Harvard thinking you have this example of an Ivy League school and think, okay, I have this information. Why can't I publish it at Idaho State University?
Yeah.
Because the kids in Idaho don't deserve to get that information. Somehow only the people who have access to Oxford University press thing, which with Oxford University probably has a higher cost for even being able to access that information behind paywalls and limited things like circulation. Like, why would you not just publish it online, put it on Dropbox, put it on YouTube, just do a whole thing like this one guy, Robert Sapolsky. I don't know if you've seen his human behavioral science
I don't
lecture
think so.
at Stanford. From 2010, he put his entire course on YouTube.
Wow.
Excellent course. I suggest anyone watch it. We have the ability to do that. If it was really about just getting information to people, why are schools still holding this thing like smog? Like, we're gonna sit over a pile of gold. It's like, no. So kids come through that environment, and I think they project that on everybody else because that's the environment that they've seen in the universities. I think even if they're not completely conscious of it, they're subconsciously aware of that. And then a lot of them go back in for postgrad. They go back in and actually get more information from the teachers. And then they see these ins and outs and just project that on the world. And then you also getting kids out and making them think this is the best way to operate.
Yeah.
And that perpetuates this whole stratification and class system. And it's disgusting to me.
I was just going to make two comments on that. The authors sort of make the analogy. It's like how only rock stars will only date like supermodels and drive nice cars and all that. It's a similar thing with universities. Like, a rock star is not going to date an unattractive woman. A Harvard researcher is not going to publish in some middle of nowhere. It's seen as like, this is beneath us. And part of it's unfair, but like part of it also makes sense. Like, if it's this good looking famous guy, he's going to be picky because he has his choice of the bunch. He's not going to, if that's why, for example, Harvard doesn't advertise at career fairs, because they know people are going to come to them no matter what. So there's no incentive to go out and try and attract people.
But I think it's kind of different in the rock star kind of way. I understand it's definitely similar in the selfishness, where it's like, okay, I can select the best for me personally.
Yeah.
That's why I want to focus on that and say, don't think these academics are in there just to teach your children. That's not what they're not in there to teach the children's. That's like a secondary thing. It's mostly that. But with the rock star thing, I think there's an extra level of, the rock star might say, like, as a celebrity, there's certain parts of my life that might not be relatable to somebody who is not a celebrity as well. Like that lifestyle of being around, being famous, having to hide. And I think with that one, that whole Jenny from the Block thing that Jennifer Lopez did, I was like, no, you're not Jenny from the Block anymore. You're a millionaire. Let's embrace that. You're different. So you're not just the same as an average person. But when it comes to education, I'm thinking information is information. An observation by a professor in Harvard is still an accurate observation, whether you read it from the Oxford University papers or from the Idaho State, or you put it on YouTube and some kid in the village in Kenya can post it up and learn from it. It's information. So, and maybe this is for me, just having such a big value of information, of knowledge, of truth. I'm feeling like these people are holding that stuff back, and it's pissing me off. Getting very expensive.
Well, it reminded me too of what your girl Sarah Silverman said at the end of her woke video about like, oh, you think I'm some liberal elite? Well, I'm from fucking New Hampshire, whatever. It's like, yes, you were at one point, but you've been in that world for so long, and you've lost touch of what other people are going through. That's the whole point. Yeah, you may have had humble roots. I don't know enough about her career. You may have worked your way up, but at some point you become sort of detached and you forget who you were, where you came from, and what life is like for ordinary people. And I think part of that's just the ego and everything, the money, all that just comes with fame. It's like, oh, I'm better than all these people now. But then it's like you lose sight of, okay, that's why the celebrities think they're cool by buying into all the woke stuff, because they think, oh, this is what people want. But it's like, no, it's academics, them, and a few other people. It's not the majority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of it. I think, part of it's also just not being aware. Yeah. All right. So, what was the other thing you had to say? I don't know if you forgot.
I was saying with restaurants, it's kind of interesting because I've seen sort of a mix of this where there are some people who work in better restaurants and think they're better than everyone, but then you also have to factor in like, what is the person doing there? Like, we'll get into this later, but how Harvard offers continuing education classes and how you're not even taught by full professors, but people will still say, I went to Harvard, and it's like, yeah, technically you did, but it's the same thing with restaurants. So like people will brag, oh, I worked at this top restaurant, but all they did was peel carrots or something. So it's like, yeah, technically that's why I would ask, okay, what did you do there? And then that also will get into questions of like, what majors are you studying? How difficult are all those majors? All that. Like, if you have a physics degree from an Ivy League school, I have no doubt that person's super smart. But it's like you have, again, gender studies or fat studies or something else from some lesser known college. Well, okay, did you just tell the professor what they want to hear, ace the course? And then it's like, but how challenged were you really? How rigorous was your work? All that.
Yeah, I'm thinking like we're talking about how elitist or out of these things are, and how convoluted some of things get. I don't want to just be dropping too many books and references in here, but that video you sent, the lecture on the elephant in the brain, that's showing. I mean, it's not new. It's not new to that book or that lecture, but the whole idea that we signal. There is something in there where we're just signaling, where it's like, look, I had the bona fides to be in this position. So I've gone through the behavior. I've gone through the motions. I've been around these people. It's not necessarily so much that I've learned this, because as we mentioned, that information can be conveyed in a myriad of ways that it's not actually being conveyed. So why are you paying that $70,000 a year at one institution versus $700 a semester at another institution? Yeah.
So moving on, what else do professors want knowledge? Well, I think you can tell professors love what they do and will delve deep into specific topics. I even saw this in culinary school, like that we laugh about people who can talk about salt for an hour or something like that. It's the same thing with academics though. Like they were saying there are people who study like Estonian tavern songs from the 13th century, or Helen Pluckrose talks about English literature and what role did women play, like all these things that like the average person doesn't think of, but like there are people who are fascinated by those topics. So for a lot of professors, that's their dream. Like, look, I can get paid to study things that I find fascinating. So
Yeah.
that's another. Yeah. Another, of course, I think this is obvious, but what else do they want? Money, fame, and status. So full professors made about $100,000 per year. This is, I think they were basing this off. I'm trying to think if this was written in 2019. I think they were basing it off 2017. So associate professors made 81,000 per year. Assistant professors made 70,000 per year. Let me point out here that the median household income in that same year was just under 60,000. So that's household income. That's not per person. And then the mean income was about 72,000. So you figure the mean is the average, and then the median is if you look at all the incomes and look at what's in the middle. So professors do all right in general, except for the lowly adjuncts.
Okay.
These numbers do vary a lot. Like for example, at Harvard here, full professors make about 220,000 a year, and the assistants make about 122,000 a year. But in contrast, Tusculum College in Tennessee, full professors make less than 43,000 per year. So again, it's also a question of where you teach. What do you do there?
And I'd also mentioned before it was about 9,000 schools, and I just checked here. It says in the fall of 2018, of the 1.5 million faculty in degree-granting post-secondary institutions, 54% were full-time and 46% were part-time. So that's it's about 800,000 full-time. Then it goes, how many professors in the United States? It's professors in the United States. In 2013, the National Center for Education Statistics counted 181,530 professors, 155,000 associate, then 166,000 assistant, 99,000 instructors, 36,000 lecturers, and 152,000 other full-time faculty. So those are the breakdowns if guys want to have that, guys and gals and everything in between want to have that tying to those figures that you mentioned. And then as you said, at Harvard, it might be 200,000. What was it that, who was it? The first Native American professor at Harvard University, one Senator Elizabeth Warren, wasn't she being paid something like 250,000 or something to teach like 2 or 3 courses?
Yeah, she was paid a lot.
So that's at one end of the spectrum, but I think on average it might, if you take away the top 10% and the bottom 10%, I think those figures will be around probably the 60,000 or something.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, on average, they said it was about associate professors about 81,000, assistant professors about 70,000, and then so that's like on average. But again, it's like people making 250 and then people making like 40. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like in something like this, I think it's useful to take out the top 10 and the bottom 10 and then see what's in there in the middle. And that's gives you a better idea of what your average person will do, because some of these things can really skew these things up. Yeah.
So tenure track professors in business, computer science, and engineering and law tend to make about 30,000 more to start on average than professors in history, psychology, or English. Just sort of as an anecdote, Jason points out that the business school parking lot at Georgetown is full of BMWs, Jaguars, and Mercedes. So if you teach the hard sciences, you get paid better on average. Now, top professors, of course, have even higher salaries. Some medical school and business school faculty even make millions a year. So professors at the humanities at places like Harvard still make 200,000 plus perks. So again, humanities lower on average, but out of everybody, they make less. You're going to make more if you teach medicine or hard science. And fame also relates to what university you're from, as I sort of touched on. So they say if you're at an event and you have an Ivy League name on your team, on a Ivy League name tag on your outfit, people are going to come up and talk to you, even if you're not well known there, just because they see the name. If you have an email address with an Ivy League name in it, people will likely respond. So if your email is Yale.edu or something to that effect, people will probably respond to that. Because again, you may be lesser known in that in that facility, but because of the school's name, people are going to spot that right away.
Mhm.
Any comments or questions?
Yeah, and now that exists, and it existed for very good reasons, I think, in the past. Now, how much of this is just the momentum of lasting on what happened in the past? Like, that's the kind of thing that you have to kind of, very hard to get to these institutions. They were doing very specific things that literally could not be done anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That you literally could not get that information anywhere else once it was actually done, just because of the realities of the world. And those things are changing, and I completely understand why these institutions, as any organism, it might not just be a direct flesh organism like we think of, but it is an organism, it is an institution, it is something that has a start, it has a lifetime, has a childhood, has its adulthood, and will die eventually. So I can understand why they're fighting to keep that prestige, keep that structure. And again, it's not negative, it's just momentum. It's just people joined it with certain beliefs, and most people are doing it for a positive reason. Even going as far where I understand why certain fields, the way these institutions work, you go to a certain field, if you're teaching STEM field, most of your alumni leave and then they get into seven-figure jobs, and then they're also donating back to the school. So it makes more sense to attract the best kind of professors for certain fields. Because if you have a whole bunch of English majors and then they're not using English directly, even if they do make a lot of money, they don't necessarily feel like, because I learned English from this professor at this institution, I'm going to donate back to that institution. They might be like, okay, that was fun. So even if I'm making seven figures, that's not as strong. But if someone is like, okay, I'm making seven figures by being an engineer, and then they make a piece of the space shuttle some new Mars lander, and they remember so and so showed me how this happens, and then even just that one memory might be like, oh, I haven't donated back, I haven't given back, and then they give an endowment of 100,000 because they had that one memory. So there's some very practical things of why certain fields. So even with that, I'm not upset about it. I understand why some of these things work, but understanding is different than co-signing or encouraging. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it was a similar thing too with my restaurant experience. Like I worked at Bar Balud, which is one of Danielle Balud's places. I also worked in Seasonal, which was an Austrian place with a Michelin star. And I had lower positions there, but people see that on my resume, that stands out. It's sort of analogous to this. Whereas like when I started, I had the retirement home that I worked at. I had my internship, which was a nice place in Boston. It was top in Boston at the time. And so those things stood out. But again, even though I didn't have very high positions there, it's people see those names are like, oh, this person might be worth it. So I can sort of relate to that a bit as well.
Yeah. And we're also talking about the prices. There's also differences people have to be concerned with. This. It's a lot of really top universities that are in rather inner city type of low income
Yeah.
areas. So even if you are getting these higher salaries, you might be living in a place that is actually you're not paying as much as the average other person who makes that same amount of salary. So you might be able to save more. Of course, chances are you have access to the cafeteria. There's also a big chance that if you're a professor and you have kids, you're not saving for university like your average person is going to be saving for university fund for your kids, because your kids can enter that university or other universities on legacy or discounted price, if not completely free. Some universities have a university town, so even if you're actually getting a home there, you might actually be renting directly from the university. There might be housing included in some of these things. So there's there's definitely a lot of reasons why professors are are very happy to maintain the system as is, and it's not just the students it's not just. I don't want to say it's just not. I don't know where I was going with this, because it's not just the students who want to maintain, because a lot of students don't really want to maintain the system because they're the ones like paying the debts. But I think there's a lot of reasons why professors are not as actively anti the system, because a lot of them who are actually in there and influential are already benefiting, and then a lot of the people who are in the system are saying, I've already put in my 10 years."
Yeah.
In order to get to that eventual position where I'll be the one sitting at the top benefiting of these things. So if I tear this system down, then my last 10 years of sacrifice, what would that be for? So that's another thing about
it. Exactly. Yeah. So moving on. So another thing, professors want freedom. I think that's pretty self-evident. Some professors get to choose which courses they teach. Others get courses assigned to them, but almost everyone, including adjuncts, they get to pick their own readings, design their syllabi, and organize things as they desire. So there's a lot more freedom than, say, I think if you're teaching public school or something. Research, of course, allows even more freedom. You can research anything you'd like as long as you can get it published in a peer-reviewed outlet that's considered good enough. So that's another thing. And the authors mentioned that's one thing they love about their jobs. They could write this book because they wanted to. They're not told you have to just research these things and that's it. So that's obviously fun. Professors tend to have very flexible schedules outside of the classes themselves. Obviously, teach class at a certain time of day, but whatever else, if you want to, usually TAs will help grade papers and things like that, so they have the freedom outside to research when they want, sleep when they want, etc. Another factor is colleagues. Of course, people want to make connections. If you're at a school where somebody becomes very successful and you're friends with that person, okay, that person can help open doors for you down the line. Of course, you can be taught by other people who are more established. I think that's pretty much makes sense. So this is interesting. A lot of teachers, they say that actually they don't want to teach. It seems because, like, for example, a lot of them will use the same books year after year and even the same multiple choice tests. College professors tend to go to conferences to share research rather than conferences to inform them how to teach. Typically, public school teachers go to conferences, which are teaching workshops. This is more about sharing research. Many often hold few office hours. Jason's colleagues even told him to hold office hours on a Friday because fewer students would come. Fame, money, and prestige depends on research rather than teaching. So that's why teachers spend more time doing that. I think we can tell. Now, of course, this gets into questions of should the teachers be doing this because the students are paying to be taught, not paying for research. So, but then this gets into conflicts where universities become famous for their research and for their discoveries, Nobel laureates, etc. So, of course, universities have an incentive to make sure that professors put out top research. I thought recently of the University of Chicago. They had Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, and George Stigler, all Nobel Prize winners. So, of course, that's where all that prestige comes from. And I think they're the third most expensive school. But again, they can afford that hefty price tag because they can say, look, we put out all these Nobel Prize winning economists. Come here and learn from the best. So,
yeah.
Now,
and with professors, it's a bit different than something like with K through 12 with Common Core, where no matter the school you go to, the English course, the material is still the same. So there's not that much in postgrad, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that the authors point
education.
Yeah. One thing that the authors point out here that's very interesting. Some of our listeners who are familiar with Austrian economics may know this already, but they actually compare researching versus teaching to the Diamond's water paradox. For those who don't know, this is where the concept of marginal utility came from. The idea, well, okay, so it was wondered in centuries past, why is it diamonds that are something that are nice, but we don't really need them? Why are those super expensive? But then why is something like water, which is necessary for life, super cheap? And they were trying to figure this out. It's like all the diamonds on Earth can disappear, we'll be okay. All the water on Earth disappears, life will die out. So they're trying to figure out why. And there were about three different economists. There was Leon Walras, who was it? Carl Menger, and there was one other guy, I'm trying to remember his name. They came up with this idea around the same time that you have to look at these things in terms of units. You have to look at each incremental unit is valuable, and the how many units are valuable relative to the demand and the supply. That's what makes these things valuable. Now, of course, obviously somebody can come at me and say, well, you can create diamonds in labs now. The De Beers diamond cartel restricts the prices by limiting the supply, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, all that is true. But looking at it from the point of 18th, 19th century, this was the understanding. How is it that something that's scarce is scarce, but it's not necessary for life? Why is this expensive, and why is something that is necessary cheap? Well, again, you have to look at the units. And our authors analogize here that the good researchers are like diamonds, the good teachers are like water. Like if all the water, as it were to disappear, the university system would collapse because nobody would be teaching. But the researchers are the diamonds because if they win a Nobel Prize or bring some other prestige to the university, that's worth way more than a few good teachers combined. So that's why. And they sort of drew the comparison too also to elementary school, where people always complain, why do athletes get paid more than teachers? But then they pointed out here, the main sports leagues, that's NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, they have a combined revenue of $30 billion, which goes to the athletes. In contrast, the US spends about 620 billion on K through 12. So now the K through 12 teachers earned about 174 billion in 2014. That, and this 174 doesn't include principals, teachers, aides, etc. So again, it's a similar idea. All these elementary school teachers are water. They're necessary for survival, but there's an abundance and there's enough of them where you don't have to pay a lot. Whereas a professional athlete is hard to come by. And it's the same thing, the researchers versus teachers in universities. It's one is necessary, but the other is much harder to come by and can bring in more value ultimately. So that's why. Any thoughts or comments?
Yeah. And with also this, it's in Human Action, and we get to the part where he uses the difference between like the price of between iron and gold. He talks about this gold is like, but when you're talking about the thing, sorry, it's about the units. You can't really make a calculation about the price of a unit compared to all the available units, or figure out what all the available units is due to the price of a unit. It's you can only decide based off of what you have available at the time in that situation, because there's never a time when someone's going to like pick between all the diamonds in the planet. This is all the water in the planet. In that situation, almost everyone would choose all the water in the planet. But that's never the question. It's like this cup of water, this glass of water now, or this big diamond. Like in that situation, you're going to pick the diamond because you know you can purchase more of the cups of water. So that's the kind of situation. But then if you're in the middle of a desert and then all of a sudden you're given that same thing, you can either take this diamond or this cup of water. In that situation, you'd probably take the cup of water. So that's the kind of thing that kind of changes with that. So and that's again why we're talking about with this valuation thing. What is the difference between a STEM professor versus an English studies professor, an English genders, poetry, basket weaving studies professor? There might be some purpose to that. There might be one student out there that would be willing to give the university millions of dollars to learn from this one expert in that. But there's going to be hundreds of thousands of students who would want to learn just something from maybe a scientific field, like any scientific field, like neurosurgery. That's different. It's medical, math, STEM. That's in science. It's science, technology, engineering, and math. Sometimes I think the M is medical, but medical comes under the science, right? Does the medical actually come under the science? It's kind of actually all of those things.
Well, I think, but I think that's referring to undergrad, and but STEM is referring to undergrad, and medical is its own thing. That's why, like it would be science. It would be the things leading up, because medical, it would be like, okay, that's a separate thing. Like you wouldn't include law in one of those categories either, because you go to a law school specifically for law.
Okay, good point. Good. Yeah. All right. Good.
All right, so let me see here. So the other point, I think you and I touched on this in the last discussion, but the faculty basically want to outsource the administration. Now, there was a book written in 2011 by Benjamin Ginsberg, where it's called The Fall of the Faculty, where he talked about how professors' roles in the university system has changed. It used to be that professors essentially took turns running the college. Like it was like, okay, I'll serve as the president, I'll go back to teaching, then you're going to serve, all that. But after a certain point, professors stopped volunteering for the positions because they wanted to spend more time researching and all that. They were hoping, I want to do what I love, I want to earn prestige that way, I want book deals, etc. So they essentially outsourced the administration to other people. Now, this is good and bad, because the one side of it is that you have people who aren't as competent or aren't as familiar with teaching and serving as faculty running things. But then the other side of it is this frees up the faculty to focus on research and other things. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here. And I've sort of seen this in restaurants as well, where there's certain people who may be great at cooking and then they move up to management. They may move up to being a sous chef or something. They're not as fit for that. They're better at cooking. But at the same time, a lot of people don't want to be line cooks forever. And I think it's a similar thing here. There became a whole professional administrators class, but they have different reasons for that. Like, for example, there's some people who just are better at administration. There are some people who they use that to gain their prestige. Like if you're president of Harvard, of course, that carries a ton of weight. Some people some people just, I guess, just like running things. So there are different incentives here, but I think in general, professors decided we'd rather focus more on our own research than on running the administration. Any thoughts or anything on that?
No, there seems to be, hmm. And this is something we would mention
Yeah.
before, where this idea of schooling in like industrial schooling as it is, this factory schooling type of thing, is the experiment. In
Yeah.
general, people were learning in through apprenticeship by professors coming to the homes, by tutors, things like that. And I think that's coming back. I don't necessarily understand why they thought creating these physical institutions where people come to this single location and stay there for an extended amount of time will somehow prepare people for the rest of the world with the moving and the way things change. It seems to be a stranger way. Let's create this one environment that is very unique, very insular. Your food is being cared for, your shelter is being cared for, your day to day is being cared for. You're being put around people who are very familiar to you, same age group, kind of same purposes. And then we're going to throw you out in the world where none of that is really,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
the case. And so it's kind of like what's going on here? We know from the start of the year this is what we're going to teach you every day. You get in the actual office. That's not the way things are.
No.
Things change constantly. So it's just I don't understand why that system has been set up that is just so against what reality actually is. It's an odd thing.
Well, I always have the discussion with people about culinary school versus the real world, because in culinary school, it's okay, make like a plate of mashed potatoes and you have hours to do it. In restaurants, it's okay, here's a list this big of things and you better get this done in like 3 hours. So you have to figure out, okay, I get this roasting, I get this on the stove, okay, I get this going here, I'm cutting this, and then these things, then I'm going to puree this, and you have to find ways, okay, how do I get all this done in a certain amount of time? And
Yeah.
it's like school, they replicate that in certain areas, like when you work in the restaurants, but it's like it doesn't compare to real restaurants, especially if you work in places that feed hundreds of people with a few staff. You have to figure out, okay, how do I get all this done in this such a short time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I understand learning some of the things where you're supposed to just these things to be second nature, kind of just like
Yeah.
in sports, you play basketball or you learn so you can just be like, okay, if I need to shoot it's muscle memory, you're doing something or if somebody says dice that, cube that, puree that, the difference. You don't have to ask the details. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering when it comes to actual education, and that's why you have a situation where
Yeah.
80% of the people say they don't actually use what they actually
Yeah.
majored in because it's not preparing them for something that's actually practical. It's it's a strange situation. It seems like the main thing is like, oh, this person can show up to a certain location and follow the guidelines for an extended amount of time, and that seems to be the main thing that's being selected for, rather than the actual information that they learned or the worth or the value of the information. It's strange.
This will come up in later in the discussion, but they've actually shown this, that students can't carry over thought processes in certain fields to other fields. Like they have that very rigid, like, okay, I apply the scientific method in this, then outside it's like I don't know what to do, and it's like, well, no, you're supposed to be trained to apply this to everything.
Yeah, no, yeah. We will when that comes up, I have some more questions and thoughts about that because there's ways to teach the critical
Yeah.
thinking versus.
Hmm.
And the thing there's critical thinking versus critical patterns. I think if it's like patterns, it's like if this content, this particular content, then I follow this formula instead
Yeah.
of teaching this formula should be applied
Yeah.
to all this content. It's a strange situation.
This is just a little bit of a divergence, but did I ever tell you about the guy from Harvard that I used to work with? That whole story.
No.
So I used to work at a retirement home. That was my first job. There was a cook there actually had a Harvard degree, and everyone was wondering like, what's this guy doing here? And it turned out the story was that he went to Harvard. I guess his parents made him, like it was a family legacy and they paid for it and everything, but it was his lifelong dream to become a chef. So
Yeah.
he went to Harvard, went to Columbia. He got a master's, Columbia. He ended up going to the Culinary Institute of America, where I went later in life. And he said he was at a point where he had more money than he knew what to do with. So he was just working for fun and living out his dream. But
Oh, wow.
but the thing is, he was a terrible cook, like super nice guy, but terrible cook. But he's what we're describing, like super book smart, like great with numbers, but like no common sense at all. And like he would drive everyone nuts. And it was one of those things where like my old boss, when he got fired, he was like relieved, and he's like, I want to erase this guy from my memory, all this. But it was funny too, because like you looked at him, he didn't look like a chef. Like he looked like a college professor. Like he was kind of nerdy, like always reading stuff, like nasally voice. And you're like, this guy's really not in the right field. And like, I felt bad in a way, because it was like, what he wanted to do versus what he should have been doing weren't the same thing. I guess he started his own business. He sells bread now or something, but
Okay.
it was just a tough thing. But it was like, I feel like academia turns out a lot of people like that, like very book smart, but like you have them, you like, if you were to give him a table and say, here, assemble this, like he would not know what to do. Like it's that kind of mentality. Yeah.
That is a weird thing.
He's one of the, I worked with this guy over a decade ago, but he still stands out in my mind, like one of the most memorable people I've worked with.
And I mean, and that's the kind of thing that goes where it's odd how when one thing is switched,
Yeah.
people think everything else has to be switched somehow, or they don't recognize how switching one thing, or the inverse also there, they don't recognize how switching something that's very central could alter everything else. Like I just saw this one thing. I'm in this group, something like food crimes. Some of them are not really that much crime.
Oh yeah,
but
you saw. I posted on that. Yeah.
Yeah, you should definitely join that group. It's an interesting group. But there's one where it was somebody cooking pancakes in the oven. They showed like they put the pancake batter, and then they put some strawberries and blueberries, and then you put it in the oven. They're like, oh, I'm never going to cook them on a pan again. And people are saying, send the recipe. And I'm like, why do you need the recipe? It's clearly just pancake batter put on like put in the oven. Like, and then on top of the send the recipe, somebody might be like, oh, maybe they mean the temperature. Maybe that's what I'm thinking now. But then even with the temperature, if you've actually baked enough, you know it's going to be about cookie temperature. It's about like what 350 centigrade or Fahrenheit. The other one's like
Fahrenheit,
175 or something. But you should be able to adjust. Shouldn't have to. Once you understand the content, you shouldn't have to get a recipe again. It's clearly pancake batter just put on a dish and put it in the oven versus on a pan. So it's kind of a weird thing.
You saw what I posted on that thread, the foie gras double down. Did you see that?
Oh yeah, the double down with the what's it called with the.
It's foie gras coated in bacon, fried with chicken skin mayonnaise and maple something. And it was funny because at Neta, towards the end there, I was talking to the last manager. He's like, "You like rich food?" He's like, "Ever try this?" And I was like, "No, even for me, that's probably too much. Like I could have like a very small like portion of it, or if it were like a croquette or something, but like a whole sandwich, I'm like, ooh, heart attack waiting to happen." That's at Joe Beef in Montreal, Canada.
It's at Joe Beef. So if anybody's ever in Montreal, Canada, go try that.
Anthony Bourdain had it on his show.
Have you actually had the double down? Like it's KFC that had it, right?
Yeah, this was a play on that, but I didn't. Yeah.
Have you had it yet? I haven't had it yet.
No.
They have one in Kenya. It's called the Nyama burger or something like that. It's just like it's the same thing: 2 fried chicken buns and then meat in the middle. I don't know. Or I think here in Kenya it was 2 fried chicken on the outside and like a hash brown in the middle. I can double check. Yeah. All right.
Okay. So next, we're going to move on to what students want. So first off, they want the credentials. Here's an interesting exercise that Jason did. He asked his students, which of these would they prefer? Number 1, graduate from Georgetown with a diploma but learn nothing. Number 2, graduate from East Podunk State College in Dublin. Or number 3, not graduate from any college but triple their knowledge. Do you know which number from most to least the students picked in?
Probably 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he said nearly unanimously A, B, and C, or 1, 2, 3 in that order. Yeah. So this is revealing. Okay, a lot of students, they just want the credentials. It's okay. I'm going to do what I have to get the credentials and get out. So I have a Georgetown diploma. That looks good, but what did I actually learn? And as you sort of touched on, a lot of the college materials can be found free of charge. Free course materials from MIT are online. Lectures from Berkeley are online. I know Harvard, you can actually sit in on some of the classes. I had a friend who actually sat in on philosophy classes there. So some of them, they'll actually let you even sit in. And of course, the challenge with that is you won't get a diploma and nobody will know you're there. So, and then
just look at the information now.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you just want to learn the information, but then it gets into the question of, okay, the credentials are what opens the door. Again, if you, like with my restaurant example, if you have these big names on your resume, people see that and that they're more likely to pick you out. So the third one here was a sort of a hard sell because it's a weaker signal. Now, that's one of the things I mentioned with Praxis in a previous conversation. That's one of the things that they've really specialized in, is how to sell yourself without the diploma. It's how do you create some work, make some videos, do something to stand out. That way you can signal to employers that you have value to add. And then, of course, once you start to gain work experience, that'll show up on your resume as well. But it's a harder thing to do, but at the same time, it can be more valuable. Like Derek McGill, the former marketing director, he went and started his own company. He did marketing work for free, but then once he did that well, he used that to get other marketing work, and then from that, put that onto a resume, and then use that to sort of springboard into other things. And some of the Praxis applicants, they say that's one of the things you have to do when you apply there, is you have to make videos or submit some creative project. Show, like, you're trying to show to your employers that you can add value in some way. And I think that these things need to be stressed more, because it shows, hey, this person took the initiative to create something. They're smart. They can create something. They can add value. It's not just coasting through, getting the piece of paper, and then how much did they learn? And that's happened at culinary school as well. People have complained standards have been lowered. So I had a teacher who graduated valedictorian, and he always hated being put in the same category as people who just coasted through, because he said, look, I was always studying. I was in the library on my spare time. I was doing this, and they're putting me in the same category as people who just coasted through the classes, did the bare minimum. And it's not really fair. And again, what does it say in terms of signaling? So,
yeah. And of course, there is something to keep in mind, that some people will have different backgrounds and lifestyles that might afford them the time to be able to put in that apprenticeship, put in that free time or internship or things like that. But it's also just a simple thing of calculating your time preferences. We always hear these stories that are put up by the media. Oh, this person came up from, I think it started, they might have been one that started this whole new trend, or how it started, how it's going. I don't know. That's a current meme that's going on.
Yeah,
one of them, I think, in particular, I don't know if this one in specific started, but apparently someone in Nigeria was studying somehow at some school in Nigeria, and then he got a scholarship to Harvard or something now. And you have those stories. So if it's possible for people in those kind of extreme cases to find time to do something that's impressive enough to get into an institution like that, or to do certain things, achieve certain job, then we can look at things in our lives and say, okay, maybe instead of doing this one thing, leisure is a positive thing. Having a better phone is a positive thing. Going to meet some friends on some night is a positive thing. These things have values, but it's something that you're making a calculation that you want to do this versus that. We almost all have lives. If you're not literally physically bleeding out and dying right now, there is probably something in your life that you can sacrifice and spend doing something else that can arguably improve your life in the future, versus taking that current good that you're seeing now, like saving that time, investing that time in something else, in some kind of skill, enrichment, or some kind of display of a personal skill, could be something that's in there. And I don't know, I think I also want to think about creating a platform for that, because one thing, being in the artistic field, visual arts and things like that, there's a lot of time where I think, I've been spending this time watching this video or listening to this thing, or even recording some of the videos where I could be like, I could be sculpting, I could be drawing, I could be working on a personal project. And I feel there's a lot of people out there, very talented people who have the ability to be creative, that don't have the outlet, or don't understand how often they can actually spend a little time here, a little time there doing something, and they could create and give something back to the world that is, or share something to the human story that is very beneficial and enriching to everybody else. So that's just my call to people, is like, yes, don't look at these people and say, oh, well, that guy was rich enough to spend some time to work for free, and then that's how come he's all wealthy and now he can start Praxis. It's like, no, he made those decisions. That same level that he was to be able to take that free work, those same connection, that same level in life could probably have been used to enter something else that was paying immediately at some different level. So it's kind of just something I have in mind.
I wanted to talk a bit about Derek McGill and his father. I used to follow both of them pretty regularly. I haven't in a little bit. I'm still sort of peripherally aware, but I don't follow as closely. Derek McGill and his dad are actually both college dropouts. Derek, I can find it for you, but he was on Tom Woods' show a while back, and he told his story how he was studying the classics. I'm trying to think if it was in Michigan or something, and he got into some issues, I guess, with affirmative action. There was actually a lawsuit. He's white himself, so I guess he sued or there was something with that, and he dropped out. But then he got into his marketing and sort of, like I said, used it as a springboard to get in other things. He was marketing director for Praxis. Now he's CEO of his own company. He's a bit younger than me, so I mean, he's really a go-getter. And then his father is interesting because he has a similar story. His father owns the Glock store in California. His father's a college dropout as well, and I guess his father and he, I guess, they're both from families that spend a lot of time in college. So when his father dropped out, everyone was like, "What are you doing? What's wrong with you?" But he started working, I guess, as a cook and then as a server, and somehow he got into radio, and then he started doing videos for Glock, like on his own, and then they ended up hiring him, and he ended up running this Glock store, and he makes good money, has a nice house and all that. But there was a podcast a while back too where he was describing his story as well, and he basically said something like, even his advice he kept emphasizing was, even if you have a job that you think is really menial or tedious, work very hard at it, because if you do, people will recognize that, and then that'll open doors elsewhere. And that's essentially what happened for him. So even if you're just a cook, okay, then you become a server, then okay, somehow he met someone in radio and he got a job doing that. But he was saying, but people saw, okay, this guy's smart, he's hardworking, so that opened up doors that way as well. And again, they were both college dropouts and ended up doing very well. So I don't think they have some superhuman abilities. It's a combination of hard work, determination, forward thinking, and just putting themselves out there, showing, okay, here's what I can accomplish, and then people, that signals to certain people who will give you a platform to do it. In short,
yeah,
yeah,
and that's again another key thing of this conversation. College is not the deciding factor. We can look at some people like college dropouts, like the Mark Zuckerbergs, like the McGills you just talked about, and say, "Oh, look, you don't need college. You can still do." It's like no, because the purpose of college is to prepare you to do something for life.
Yeah.
So if you can find something to do in life, this whole I'm educated, I'm credentialized, that's not that important. The key is, can you do something to make a living, to maintain a living, to be something that is productive? If you could do that without college, like majority of the world doesn't have a college degree. Specifically, the vast majority, 99.999% of the world, does not have a college degree from the institution that you went to. So even if you think going to that particular institution and getting that particular degree was very central for you to make a living, for you to be productive, understand that isn't the case for 99.99999% of the people alive today, because they did not go to that university. So the key thing is finding something you're able to do, and I think there's better ways to do it. In general, we shouldn't just have this ultra focus, like, if I can't make it to university, I'm not going to be able to achieve anything. Yeah.
So moving on, students want less work and more play. They said students spend far more time on leisure now than in the past. In the 1960s, students spent about 40 hours a week studying or in class. Today, it's about 27 hours. So you figure 40 hours a week, that's a full-time job. Essentially, now it's a little over half of a full-time job. So in 1961, college students spent 25 hours a week studying. As of 2003, it had fallen to about 13. So again, about cut in half. Faculty have been assigning less work since the 1960s in terms of less reading and also shorter essays. I think they cite some numbers in the book. I didn't include them here, but if people really want to know, I can dig them up. So the last point, as far as students want to pay low costs. In the 1970s, James Buchanan and Nikos Devletoglu, I don't know if I'm saying it, looks like a Greek name. They made 3 observations regarding the publicly funded University of California system. So it's not publicly funded anymore, but this is what they noticed when it was publicly funded. Students consume the product but don't pay for it. Faculty provide the product but don't sell it. The public pays for it but doesn't consume it. So this sort of relates into our point about 7 economic insights. It distorts all these mechanisms. Instead of, I want this thing, I buy it directly, I pay for it with my own money, I know what I'm getting, versus this person pays for it, this person uses it, this person provides it but doesn't sell it. It distorts the whole thing, essentially.
Yeah.
And then so basically students and parents today do shoulder more of the cost than in the past. But of course, we're going to get into that later on with issues with student loans and other things. So the first point, as far as students not paying for it, that doesn't apply as much anymore because students do pay for it, but the other points do, especially when you get into things like subsidies, grants, and all that. And of course, faculty guaranteed jobs, but they don't have to provide value as directly. And the problem, in short, is a small but highly motivated group of people push for some pet project that is expensive, but the cost is dispersed among the students and or taxpayers. So each individual project will cost a little bit to each person, but factor in that that's happening hundreds or thousands of times. So that's what economists call the concentrated benefits dispersed costs. It's, oh, well, we'll tax everyone a little more for this. It'll only benefit these people. But again, add this up hundreds or thousands of times, it creates all these issues that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts or comments?
And that's something with the students. And another good thing that I've seen with like tech coming up is I don't know what there's one main website or application that does this, where a lot of students from major universities and schools go to actually rate and grade their teachers.
Yeah.
But for a long time, that wasn't a thing. That wasn't a thing that was done. And now, when you look at K through 12, on a lot of situations, students aren't actually allowed to grade their teachers, to say, this is how I'm experiencing this learning environment. If you are in, I think, a healthy environment to learn and from anyone, you should be able to give feedback. The teacher, I think if you're teaching somebody, you would want to have good feedback from the person you're teaching if that was your main interest.
Yeah.
But why are so many teachers against that? At K through 12 right now, we're seeing this remote learning during the pandemic. Several stories coming out where teachers are saying, we don't want parents to come and see what we're teaching the kids. And yeah, they say, oh, we need privacy, or this parent is racist, so we want to teach them our social justice stuff, and they might come in. But that's not what you're there to teach the kid.
Yeah.
Like, if you're teaching the kid mathematics, you're teaching the kid biology, like, just teach them the biology. And then on top of that, if the parent is being taxed through property taxes and things like that to pay your salary, they, as some customer, as a paying customer, why shouldn't they be able to actually look into the actual content or actual service that they're paying for? Like, but you're like, oh, you don't pay me, but the parents don't pay me, the government does. It's like, no, the government gets that money. We distribute that money from the parents. And like, oh, the students, it's not my job to make sure the student actually does well after. I'm supposed to just tell the student what I was told to do by the person who's paying me, who's the government, who's giving me this thing. So yeah, it's a mixed up situation, and I think we can cut out many middlemen and get closer to an environment where the people who want to teach are teaching in a better way, and those who want to learn are being taught in a better way. Yeah.
But think about how that contrasts with something like a restaurant or buying a product from a local vendor. It's you spend your own money out of your own pocket. You know what you're getting. If there's issues, you can return it. You can write a bad review. If it's good, you can write a positive review. There's that very direct line. Whereas with this, again, okay, this money, taxation money, comes from here. This person pays for it. This person uses it but doesn't pay for it. This person has to pay for this but doesn't want it. It distorts all these mechanisms. So we don't get down to the meat of it as far as, are people getting what they want? Is it worth it? All that.
And this K to 12 thing does have an influence in that higher education kind of environment, because there could be some of that where people have been indoctrinated into this, and that's why, as people of adult age, they also feel the need that society should provide for them in that kind of environment where they feel things should be just selected and chosen. That, if they were able to know and choose what we were supposed to eat, what we were supposed to do, where we were supposed to go, how we were supposed to live when we were in kindergarten through high school, then why shouldn't they not be able to do that when we're adults? And my argument is, no, they weren't really able to do it ever. It's not that they were able to do it when you're a teen and then a preteen, and then now they're unable as an adult. It's like, no, even as a teen and a preteen, what they were doing was not actually good.
So moving on, we're going to talk about what administrators want. So first off, I think it's obvious a promotion. Their career path, it's not as well defined as traditional professors. They're usually people who taught previously but decided to switch to administration earlier on in their career for other reasons. Again, some people find they're just better at administration. Some people, they're in a lower position they're in a lower position within a certain department. They find that this is sort of a step up. Sometimes people want the prestige that comes with certain administrative positions, or the boost in salary, or both. Sometimes a person is promoted to administration as a way to get them out of their current position because they're causing problems. Lower level administrators have quadrupled in the past 40 or so years. In 1976, there were about 200,000 of them. Today, it's over 800,000. They call them educrats, of course, education and ocracy. Yeah, educrats. Yeah. So educrats do a lot of different things, from admissions, athletics, student affairs, regulatory compliance, etc. They also tend to get involved in political causes like the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We've seen a lot of that. These jobs are usually taken as stepping stones to higher positions. Any comments or thoughts on that?
No. Why do they go into any of the reasoning of why these institutions seem to skew so much to Democrat when you're talking about teachers' unions and things like that? Or is that more for under? No, there's not. Teachers' unions don't really apply so much in higher education, right? So
no, it's elementary school.
K
through 12. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you can scratch that. I mean, just in general, I'm not against unionizing. I wouldn't want to enter a field where I had to join a union because I think there's very few reasons I would imagine doing it. But when it comes to public sector unions, I already answered my question, because when it comes to public sector union, no, I don't necessarily answer my question. But when it comes to public sector union, whichever party is promising them more gives, which is usually the Democrats, they will support more because they're public sector, they're being paid by tax money. So of course they'll want whoever's taxing people more.
We'll get more into this later on this section on rent seeking, but this happens to a lot of different departments and organizations within the university, where a few people go to administration and complain, "Hey, we want this, we want more of this, gives me this," as you say, and but then of course what happens? Oh, we'll raise everyone's tuition a little bit, but then again, if every group does that, well, you add it up by the end. This is why you're paying so much money for stuff that you don't benefit from. It's you have to look at that cumulative effect, but all those different groups, like in that public choice video, Anthony Davies brought up, like, okay, like a corn producer lobbies for a tariff on sugar. They think, oh, we'll raise all foreign sugar by a bit, and it's like the average person on the street is not going to go out and protest that. It's just everyone has to pay more for products made with foreign sugar now, but they want to appease that one group, and they feel the costs are dispersed enough that nobody's going to make a huge deal about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm checking here. I just wanted to double check. They say, do college professors have unions? The American Association of University Professors is an organization of professors and other academics in the United States of America. The AAUP membership includes over 500 local campus chapters and 39 state organizations. So this might be focused more on. There's also public universities, of course. There's very few, actually. Majority of them have some, at least, public-private relationship when it comes to higher education universities. But I don't think these would be compulsory. Whereas if you go into a public school in pretty much all the states, I think in the United States of America, you have to join the union. It's like almost compulsory, I think, in all the places. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Let's see here.
We talked about administration. Now, where are we on?
No. There's more for administration here. Okay. So let me see here. So, of course, there's sort of the trade-off between how much faculty do you want versus how much administration. So the challenge is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of faculty, they don't want to do administrative stuff. They just want to focus on their research and maybe teaching. And they would rather have other people do administration, but of course that adds to higher tuition costs and of course higher budget for the college as a whole. So administrators the people running the schools have to sort of weigh that cost benefit of how much administration do we want, how many teachers do we want teachers to play a role in administration, or do we want them just to focus on their work? Now, the authors don't take any position on this. It depends on the university and all that. It's a lot of factors come into this. How much research output do you have? Is it worth having those people just focus on research and having other people administer? It gets complicated. It depends on the university, but there is a trade-off. For example, a $250,000 a year salary for an administrator is money that could have been used on students or a different teacher or something. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So economist William Niskanen, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, argued that we should model bureaucracies as budget maximizers in contrast with traditional businesses, which are profit maximizers. His work showed that if you want to understand how departments work, look at the fact that they all want a higher budget, notably a higher discretionary budget. So a college, the way it runs is they all constantly push for more funding, whereas a private business, they can only spend the money that they bring in. So like a restaurant can't go and lobby for tax dollars or subsidies from some outside force. They just have to do more business. So that distorts the whole incentives where they want more funding, they want more the higher budget, because then they can use that for higher salaries, more research, all that. Now, looking at it from their point of view, of course, that makes sense. But then the question becomes, where does that money come from, and is it worth giving it to them?
Yeah.
So, in the fall of the faculty, Ginsburg explains the problems that with the incentives that the administrators face. For example, if you want more funding for your department or even more money for yourself directly, you can do two things. You can either hire more people, so the larger the staff you have, the greater of a budget you're allowed. The more people you have under you, the more important you're considered, so it's easier to justify a raise. And you can also use that to expand the scope of your department. If you choose to take on more tasks, you can justify more budgeting, office space, and new hires. This has been called mission creep, where certain departments focus on things that are outside of their purview. Like they talk about certain departments now focusing on environmental issues when as you sort of touched on in your example, well, you're not being paid to do that, but they do that because it justifies more funding, staffing, etc.
Yeah.
So any comments or?
It's just, again, what is the product here?
Yeah.
What are the key things that the people are trying to produce? Is the purpose of the organization of a university to provide an environment for people to teach? Are the teachers the customers? Are the students the customers? Are they buying information from there? Is that like a unique position? When it's to the world in general, what is the main purpose of it? Are the students the product of the universities? But if the students are the product, then the product can't pay the institution for a product. The product is the end product. What is, in general, at least what do you think? It's more of like a question, just a general question to everyone who's listening, is what would you say the product of a university is? What is the product of higher education? Like the end product, where it's like, okay, this is a thing that we can say, or we can compare and say, okay, this institution of higher learning is better because this product, the key product that they produce, is just comparatively better than any other institute of higher education. And it's a good question to kind of think of answering.
Well, for me, it's also a question of value, because being a food guy, I think like, oh, if I go to McDonald's, I'll spend like $8, but what do I get? Okay, cheap burgers and fries, versus I go to a nice restaurant, I may spend 100, 150, 200, whatever. But if it's solid food, well, it's worth the value. And I think what's recurring here, as I've just sort of touched on with the whole finance and the way the incentives are structured, I don't know too many people who are saying, "Oh, this was worth the $50,000 a year or whatever I paid to go here." I've seen very few, if any, people who have ever said that, and I think that bears worth questioning at least.
Yeah, and then that's a good example with the restaurant stuff, where there's some things where it's like, okay, I'm okay with delivery. Where it's kind of like, okay, if you get your Big Mac delivered, it's not really going to taste different. The experience of that meal is not going to be that much different than you actually go into the store. In fact, like the drive-through, the delivery might actually be better because you can have some silence and you have more selection over your environment to consume that same exact meal. But then you go to a Michelin star restaurant, there is the ambiance, there is the extra, there is this other experience where you can say, okay, there actually is a difference being served in a certain time, in this certain environment, in a certain lighting. And there's other aspects that you can say add, where if the food is just delivered to your home and it's dropped off, it's not necessarily the same. It's still the same actual literal food, but it's not the same. So now that's a question now you that comes into with somebody's Harvard. Like these Ivy League schools. If you're reading Shakespeare, is the book really that much different if you're in some campus in New England versus in some school in some small town in Alabama? I'm not quite sure how different the actual experience would be in that situation.
Well, because to bring it back to the restaurants thing again, it illustrates the Austrian principle of subjective value. Like I've sort of made this comparison. I have some friends who are really into cars, and I've said, even if I had a ton of money, it would be harder for me to justify getting like the nicest car, because in my mind, it's like, I don't know how those things differ. Like I know a Lamborghini is a nice car, a Ferrari is a nice car, but I can't tell you, why does this car cost $250,000 or whatever it is. Whereas with them, it's kind of the reverse. If they go to these nice restaurants, they're going to say, okay, this is a nice meal, but it's kind of lost on me. Like I had a roommate who was like that. Like he told me he had a friend who I guess owned at the time, it was a top restaurant in New Orleans, and I guess he actually paid for it. And he's like, it was a nice meal, but he's like, I felt like it was lost on me. Like I wouldn't go on my own and spend that money because I would feel like, why is this really worth it? So it
Yeah.
comes down to what you value. But I think if you have enough knowledge in that certain area and you prefer it enough, you can sort of illustrate the differences. Like I know if I go to a 2 or 3 Michelin star restaurant, as you say, okay, I'm going to have all these staff, I'm going to have all these courses, everything's going to be explained to me. They're going to pair my wine, all that. So as I often say, it's not just a meal, it's an experience, but you're paying for all those details, all the quality of the food, all that craftsmanship, et cetera. So you can sort of calculate, why would this be worth more? But again, back to the college thing, is it really worth that much more? And I think they say later in the book, if you take economics 101 at Princeton or some lesser known school, it's pretty much the same material. Is it really worth paying more, or is it just the brand Princeton on your resume?
Yeah, because there is a difference. Maybe the example I was giving earlier is not quite the same, because when we said the Michelin star restaurant versus McDonald's, like even a burger at a Michelin star restaurant will have different ingredients, fresher
If they have a burger.
maybe like Wagyu beef. Yeah, if they have a burger or equivalent, let's say it's a burger, it's a burger. So they have something like hamburger or something like that. And then so let's say it was to say, if it's Shakespeare in both places, the equivalent would be like, what if you took the literal exact Big Mac, but you plated it and served it in the environment of a Michelin star restaurant. Or you took that foie gras burger you're talking about, and then you plated that and served it just in a brown bag like you do at McDonald's. And would that actually change the actual content of the thing so much? So yeah, that's
there's also food that doesn't travel well, like foie gras. If it's made cold, it'll oxidize once you cut it, so you have to eat it pretty quickly. Of course, if it gets too warm, it's gonna melt. If it's hot, I mean, if it's seared, it's like you want to eat it pretty soon, because if you were to heat it up again, foie sort of melts. It gets seared, but it also melts as you heat it more. So there's certain quality concerns as well there.
There's got to be some tests of that. It seems to be something that somebody would have done a test of, like have somebody be like, okay, this is a burger from McDonald's, and they give you that same burger, but they say it's from, or you go to another restaurant and they serve you the same food, and then they say this is. I think there was something when I was going through. I think almost everyone who spends enough time online on YouTube, in particular, will go through a Gordon Ramsay like spiel where you just watch a bunch of his things, and I think he had one of those times where he did something like that, where he said it was either other people served his food and then he said it was him who made it, or it was some kind of thing.
It was a hotel episode where he wanted to convince the owner to change the menu, so he had the chef do things, and he said, "Oh, I came up with this," and the owner was like, "This is really good," but he was like, "No, actually, it was the chef who came up with them, not me." But he wanted the chef to try them, and then the owner was like, "Okay, maybe I sold him short a bit." Yeah.
That's the kind of thing you were talking about earlier with the perception, where people would choose the university and things like that because people employ people off of that credential, not necessarily even being able to actually or spend the time to actually study and see, does this person actually know what I'm hiring them for? And yeah, that's part of why business fails so much.
It goes to your point in one of the earlier videos about campus reform, where you ask people, oh, Joe Biden said this. Do you think it's great? Oh, yeah. Oh, no, it was Trump who said that. Wait, what? And then there's the reverse. But again, it's that perception of it. They're not weighing the value of the thing objectively. They're just saying, I like the person or where it comes from. And it's like, that's where, again, value is subjective. It's their choice. But at some point, you have to realize, okay, like we say, a McDonald's burger, just because you tell people it comes from a high place, does it really become better in quality? It's just the perception that it is.
The elephant in the room that we're lying to ourselves. Yeah.
So let's see here. So in short, administrators have an incentive to oversupply their services. They end up creating unnecessary jobs and hiring unnecessary staff, which others pay for. This causes universities to suffer from administrative bloat. In the past 40 years, colleges have increased their administrative and non-administrative teaching staff by 300% or more. In contrast, the total number of students grew about 50%, and the number of full-time faculty has increased about 50%. Yale spends about $60,000 a year on administration per student. On $60,000 per year on each student in terms of administrative costs. Wake Forest spends about $75,000 a year per student on administrative costs. So Ginsburg goes on to argue how the value of all these administrators is negligible, if any. Colleges got by fine about 40 years ago with far fewer administrators. Why do we suddenly need them now? I would also add on to that with technology now, you could streamline and automate a lot of this stuff. You could probably do less administration even. So this was interesting here. Colleges have a perverse incentives to raise costs. The U.S. News and World Report's annual Best Colleges is considered the best for measuring college rankings. But here's the thing: 10% of the score the college gets relies on how much money is spent per student. The more a college spends, the better it ranks. So, quick example, I brought it up before. The University of Chicago is ranked number 3. But if they were able to provide the same education and research but cut back administration costs to 0, their number would drop to 14. So a lot of their number comes from how much they're spending. And then if Yale, which is tied with Chicago, if they did the same thing, they dropped to number 11. In contrast, if the College of William and Mary, which is ranked 32, but provided the same quality at 50 times the current cost, they would rise to 27. So if there's the incentive to spend more money, they're going to spend it. But of course, they don't examine where does this go, or does it really produce the quality worth the cost. So in short, a private firm can produce more output at a lower cost. If they can do that, they're more successful. In the university system, the colleges that produce the same output at a higher cost get a better ranking and are considered more successful. So again, a restaurant, you want to have a food cost below a certain level. You want to have profit margins above a certain level. But universities, if you spend more money, you get better ranking. So there's that incentive to spend more and to justify spending more. So Ginsburg also talked about the increased regulations and the cost of complying with regulations. Colleges lobby for regulation to become better entrenched and to justify hiring more staff, which allows for bigger budgets. So this will get later into the section on rent seeking, but they want those regulations because it's a way of shutting out competitors. It's higher costs of complying with them. But again, because they're not funded directly, they can use this to justify more subsidies and other things. So it's a bit different from whereas if a private firm lobbies for regulation, it's because they can absorb the cost themselves. Like the example they bring up later is that Coca-Cola may push for higher water standards, but they can afford to hire a team of chemists, which to a multi-billion-dollar company is not much, but to a little mom and pop shop, it's going to put them out of business. Whereas with this, it's a similar thing, but because they're not being funded directly, as I say, they don't really care because they'll find ways they'll either jack up tuition, then it'll guarantee bigger loans, or they'll push for subsidies or something. So that cost is forced on other people. Any thoughts?
There's always an aspect of this where, unfortunately, when we start talking about some of these things, as you mentioned, just already the disconnect. The government is paying, but they don't actually use the actual service. The schools are being paid, but then what was it they said? Okay, the government is paying, but they're not using the service. There was the schools, and then the students are utilizing it.
The students are using it, but not paying for it, and the faculty is not selling it directly.
Okay, and then the government is paying, but not actually consuming it.
Yeah, the taxpayers are paying for it,
that already knocks things off. Then just the nature of the state itself kind of mutates things.
Yeah.
So some of the things when we judge and we look at this, it's not. It's like something has been irradiated, and then we're seeing this creature come out from this effect, from this environment. That's not necessarily the market. So when people blame market forces, this isn't a healthy market to begin with.
No.
And I'm sure there's going to be different levels of when the things started changing. But I'm guessing part of this began post-war when the GI Bill came in and there was lots of money starting to be funded towards universities at large.
That's part of it. The other thing was, are you familiar with the Supreme Court case, Griggs versus Duke Power?
No, not necessarily.
That's a bit controversial, but it had to do with when IQs were considered discriminatory. So that was the Supreme Court case that banned employers from administering IQ tests or some version of it. Of course, the reason was because at the time, minorities on average weren't scoring as high, so it was seen as discriminatory. So it was then passed on to colleges that colleges have to sort out who are the best, the smartest, the hardest working, all that. So instead of having one of those aptitude tests, you had to get a degree, and that would sort of show, okay, you've been filtered out through all of this. But then, of course, what happened is more and more people were pushing to go to college. So then in turn, colleges of course, started lowering their standards because they wanted more tuition money, all that. And then, of course, the whole thing with, well, not everyone can afford college. Let's guarantee student loans. Colleges, of course, jack up the price. And then all these other various factors we're talking about. And then that's why I have to remember the number, but college costs have risen a few thousand% since the 70s. And they're making the point that imagine if food or something. I mean, obviously the cost of food has gone up proportionate if you factor in inflation. But if the cost of food went up a few thousand%, there'd be a revolution, because that's typically when revolutions start. People can't afford to eat. But then you have to ask is why are people just sort of sitting there and saying, well, that's just how things are. Let's just take this. No, it's because of all these various incentives, and people, the colleges aren't going to do anything because they like the money. But at the same time, a lot of students and parents, they don't want to take the time and energy to fight this because they see it as either they can't win or it's not worth the time or some other form of rational ignorance that we talked about in the previous video.
Especially with the food, it's the complete, almost the complete inverse of it. Yeah. Where in universities, in the education system, you have the cost going up that 1,000%, but you look at the teacher to student ratio. If anything, it's dropped. If anything, now there's a lot more students to every teacher. Every person is supposed to be given a thing. Yet with food, it's the inverse, where prices are dropping, and there's the explosion of restaurants, explosions of just the different diversity that you can actually get your hands on. Like if you want to eat any meal from any country anywhere, it's available and it's there in many different forms. Even delivered directly to your home. Now that's another big burgeoning thing. They found ways like, you don't have to come to the restaurant, we'll bring it to you. So, and that's a physical, actual thing that needs to take these ingredients from this place, be cooked at this location, be brought to you. You've gone now into places where there's a bigger industry with one of those guys where they deliver you like a food set up in a box, already chopped and everything. It's like, just put it in the pan for this amount of time. Like it's gotten to that point. There's a revolution in many other industries, but education has just grown bigger and bigger and more just ineffective and it's really a bad situation.
Well, the quality of food always impresses me too. I mean, there are old school chefs who have said like, oh, a lot of the younger chefs now are more talented than I was at this age, and they've talked about how in New York you used to have a handful of nice French restaurants. Now you have all these great restaurants of various backgrounds, and again, what was considered great 30 years ago would be like okay now. So that says a lot.
Yeah. So there's definitely improvements that can occur in the industry that are not being done yet, that I think will be done now.
So just the last point for administrators, they also want job security. They can win tenure, and if the college is facing trouble, they'll actually get fired along with non-tenured faculty first. So this creates two incentives. Administrators want to be seen as busy, so they're considered essential. Now, this is hard to measure because you can't measure an administrator's output because they're not doing research or anything. They're just supervising. So administrators get around this by spending time in meetings, which are sometimes just talking about things that happen in other meetings and reporting to other administrators about other meetings. I always think of that Thomas Sowell quote about people who enjoy meetings should never be in charge of anything. And the authors have even talked about how a lot of the other faculty will actually just communicate via email because they see it as, look, I'm too busy, I'm doing research, I'm teaching, I'm not going to spend time in meetings. But the administrators seem to enjoy it because it makes it look like they're doing something. And then the other thing the administrators want to do too is they want to replace tenure track faculty with non-tenure track faculty. Again, this will be explained more in the section on tenure, but the idea is that faculty without tenure are more easily replaced and they're easier to control because they're easier to fire. And again, if the college faces financial issues, they're more likely they're going to have to the administrators would have to compete with the tenure and the non-tenure track, and of course the people who run the college are more likely to get rid of the non-tenure track first. So that sort of protects the administrators a little bit, but that means the administrators have an incentive to make sure that there are fewer staff members with tenure. That makes sense. So
yeah.
It's sort of like as a manager, like sorry, what were you going to say?
I said you get what you incentivize.
Yeah. Well, it was a similar thing with a manager. Like when the place is slow, I would do more work myself, but there's an incentive for me to do that because it's like I keep getting paid my same salary, so it justifies my position, but it saves the restaurant money at the same time. And ideally, I would rather have other workers do it, but if they did, it would cost the restaurant more money. If the place is slow, they would lose money. Then it's, okay, we're either going to have to cut budgets or close. Whereas at least with this, it can sort of keep the place afloat. And then once things get better, okay, staff starts coming in again.
So. Yeah, and that's why it's kind of useful when you have those they're is it redundant? What do they say? Where somebody can be an administrator, but then if a course needs to be taught, they can jump in and teach that course. So people are more flexible that way versus having people who's like, oh, this person can only do this, and we're only relying on this person to be able to do that. And also by having fewer people on tenure, whether you agree with tenure or not, but just fewer people in that kind of permanent type of contract, those people can also be constantly be poached by other institutions. Other places can be like, oh, we'll offer you something better. So you might be like, oh, we're just relying on this one person, and then somebody poaches them away. So yeah, that's going to reduce your actual services, and so there's many complications that come with this.
So just to finish, there are no gremlins or poltergeists, just many individuals responding to incentives set by the system.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it off.
That's it for chapter 2. Do you have any more concluding thoughts, Silas? Or
I think no. I think we covered a lot. We got into the conversation parts in between them, and it seems to be a rather concise book so far. It's going really well. Yeah. So that was Gremlins and Poltergeist, or that was
no. It's what academics want. It's just continuing that analogy.
He did, yeah. Sorry, yeah. So it's a callback. Like, good callback. Good callback, Stephen. Yes. So that's what I think they did a really good job naming the table of contents of this book, and looking forward to the rest of it as it develops. So yeah, that's it. I don't think I have much more to say on this chapter. I enjoyed the conversation as usual, Stephen. Anything else?
It was good. That's all I have.
Okay, so thank you for listening. For those of you who are listening to the series, more to come. We shall keep recording these. I'll let Stephen just stay on. I think we're probably done recording for today, but definitely get another recording set up tomorrow. But yeah, so we'll talk about that, Stephen. For now, everybody else out there, goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Hope you enjoyed.